This is a recorded presentation summarizing Atlantic striped bass Draft Amendment 7 for public comment. My name is Emily Franca, and I am the Fishery Management Plan Coordinator for striped bass at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. This presentation will start with an overview of the Commission, followed by background on Draft Amendment 7, the amendment timeline, and an overview of the issues and proposed options in the draft amendment. And the presentation will conclude with instructions for providing public comment. And Draft Amendment 7 is posted online on the ASMFC Public Input webpage at the link shown on the screen. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission was formed in 1942 as an interstate compact between the 15 Atlantic coast states from Maine through Florida. And the Commission is a deliberative forum for those states coordinating management for species in state waters, which is 0 to 3 miles from shore. And while each state is represented on the Commission by 3 commissioners, each state gets 1 vote in the decision-making process. The Commission's Atlantic Striped Bass Management Board includes the states from Maine through North Carolina, and it also includes the District of Columbia, the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, as well as the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. For the Commission's Striped Bass Fishery Management Plan, the last amendment to that plan was adopted in 2003, which was Amendment 6. And since then, the status and understanding of the striped bass stock and fishery has changed considerably. And the 2018 benchmark stock assessment indicated the striped bass stock has been overfished for a number of years and is experiencing overfishing. And this changed the perception of striped bass stock status. And the results of that stock assessment tripped management triggers, requiring the board to take action to address overfishing and to address the overfished status of the stock. In April 2020, the board implemented Addendum 6 to Amendment 6 to end overfishing, and those Addendum 6 measures are designed to achieve at least an 18% reduction in coastwide removals of striped bass. And then following that Addendum 6 action in August 2020, the board initiated development of Amendment 7. And Amendment 7 is intended to update the striped bass management program to better align with current fishery needs and priorities, and to build on that Addendum 6 action to initiate stock rebuilding. In January 2022, Draft Amendment 7 was approved for public comment with proposed options to address the following issues: management triggers, recreational release mortality, rebuilding plan, and conservation equivalency. The full Amendment 7 timeline is shown here. So Amendment 7 was initiated in August 2020, and in February 2021, the board approved for public comment the public information document referred to as the PID. And the PID was the broad scoping document for Amendment 7 that was seeking public comment on a number of management issues. So following the PID public comment period, in May 2021, the board selected issues for development in the draft amendment, and the plan development team developed the draft amendment over several months from May through December 2021. And then in January 2022, the board approved Draft Amendment 7 for public comment, and the deadline for submitting public comments is April 15th, 2022. And then in May of 2022, the board will review public comment and consider selecting final measures for the amendment, and the final amendment could be approved at that time in May. Regarding implementation, the timeline for implementation will be determined by the board during final approval of the draft amendment at the May meeting. So any new management measures requiring states to change regulations, so for example, seasonal closures or gear restrictions, those would likely be implemented in 2023 to allow time for states to make those regulatory changes. Management triggers, on the other hand, are typically implemented immediately, so any new triggers would be evaluated during the next stock assessment. And that next stock assessment is expected later this year in October. The draft amendment document is comprised of several different sections, and Section 1 includes the statement of the problem, a description of the resource in the fishery, and habitat considerations. Section 2 includes the history of striped bass management, the goals and objectives, and a description of the reference points. Section 3 specifies monitoring programs, including data for catch and landings, and also for biological information. Section 4 is the management program and proposed options section, which includes management triggers, recreational and commercial management measures, the rebuilding plan, conservation equivalency, and also includes the adaptive management section. Section 6 describes management and research needs. And finally, Section 7 describes potential interactions with protected species. This presentation will focus on the proposed options for changes to the management program in Section 4. So before moving into the proposed options and potential changes, it is important to note that some management measures are staying the same at this time. So these measures may change in the future, but are staying the same at this time. Draft Amendment 7 maintains the same recreational size and bag limit requirements as Addendum 6, and Draft Amendment 7 also maintains the same commercial size limits and commercial quota allocations as Addendum 6. So all approved Addendum 6 conservation equivalency programs and state implementation plans are maintained for these measures. But if these measures are changed in the future, so for example, if these measures are changed in response to the upcoming stock assessment, then new implementation plans and new conservation equivalency proposals, if applicable, would be required. So the rest of the slides will focus on the proposed options for changes to the management program. And those proposed options, again, address the following 4 issues: management triggers in Section 4.1, recreational release mortality in Section 4.2.2, the rebuilding plan in Section 4.4, and conservation equivalency in Section 4.6.2. So starting with Section 4.1, management triggers. The management triggers are intended to keep the board accountable, and they determine when the board is required to make management adjustments. So the management triggers are based on the biological reference points, which are the female spawning stock biomass target and threshold, and the fishing mortality target and threshold. There is also a recruitment management trigger that's based on juvenile abundance indices, or JAIs. So starting with the current status quo triggers, the first 2 triggers are based on the thresholds for fishing mortality and spawning stock biomass. And the 2018 assessment indicated the stock was experiencing overfishing and was overfished, which tripped both of these triggers. And the assessment results are shown here, with fishing mortality on the left as the blue line, which is above the threshold, tripping the current F threshold trigger, and SSB on the right, which is below the threshold, tripping the SSB threshold trigger. And because these triggers were tripped, the board implemented Addendum 6 to address overfishing in 2020 and is required to rebuild the stock by 2029. The current management triggers also include triggers based on the targets for F and SSB. And these target triggers evaluate levels of F and SSB together in order to trip these triggers. So these target triggers may trip when F and SSB are between the target and the threshold, so between the dashed and the solid lines on these figures. The current recruitment trigger trips if a juvenile abundance index shows recruitment failure for 3 consecutive years. So currently, if the trigger is tripped, the board reviews the cause of recruitment failure and determines the appropriate action. And this trigger has only tripped 1 time since 2003. There are some shortfalls with how the current management triggers are designed. And the first is that when female spawning stock biomass is below the target, the variable nature of fishing mortality from year to year can result in a continued need for management actions. And the shorter timetables for taking corrective action are in conflict with the desire for management stability over time. And the board is sometimes criticized for considering changes to management before the stock has had a chance to respond to previous management changes. And then also the use of point estimates does not account for a level of uncertainty. And then finally, long periods of below average recruitment has raised questions about why the recruitment trigger has not tripped more often. So to address these concerns, the proposed options consider how to set the management triggers in Amendment 7 and whether to change any of the status quo triggers. So the trigger options are categorized into different tiers. Tier 1 is the fishing mortality triggers. Tier 2 is the female spawning stock biomass triggers. Tier 3 is the recruitment trigger. And Tier 4 considers deferred management action. When considering these options, it's important to note when the triggers are evaluated. So F and SSB triggers are evaluated every 2 to 3 years following stock assessments, while the recruitment trigger is evaluated every year. And the deferred management options consider whether the board needs to respond immediately if a trigger is tripped. So starting with Tier 1, fishing mortality triggers, the first set of options is option A, which is the timeline to reduce F to the target. So if an F trigger is tripped, management must be adjusted to reduce F to the target. And the question here is, how quickly does the board need to act to reduce F if an F trigger is tripped? Sub-option A1 here is the status quo, where management must be adjusted to reduce F to the target within 1 year. Sub-option A2 would extend that timeline to reduce F to the target within 2 years. Option B defines the F threshold trigger. And the question here is, should the trigger trip based on the F from only the last year of the stock assessment, or should this trigger trip based on the average of 2 years of data to address variability from year to year? So B1 is the status quo option, where the trigger is tripped if F exceeds the threshold in the most recent year, and B2 would trip if the 2-year average of F exceeds the threshold. Option C defines the F target trigger, and the questions here are, should action be required based on F being above the F target alone, regardless of SSB? And the other question is, should there be an F target trigger if there's already an F threshold trigger? C1 is the status quo trigger, where the trigger trips if F exceeds the target for 2 years and if SSB is below the target in either year. Sub-option C2 would trip if F exceeds the target for 3 consecutive years, and C3 would eliminate the trigger related to F target. Moving on to Tier 2, which are the female SSB triggers. If an SSB trigger is tripped, management must be adjusted to rebuild SSB to the target within 10 years. So the question here is, should there be a deadline for getting a plan in place to rebuild the stock? And the status quo, option A1, is no deadline for when a rebuilding plan must be implemented, while A2 would require the board to implement a rebuilding plan within 2 years from when the trigger is tripped. Options B and C are the SSB trigger definitions. And the questions here are, should there be a trigger for both the SSB threshold and the target? And should action be required based on SSB levels alone, regardless of how high fishing mortality is? So option B defines the SSB threshold trigger. B1 is the status quo option, where the trigger is tripped if SSB is less than the threshold, so the stock is overfished. Sub-option B2 would eliminate the trigger related to the SSB threshold. And then option C defines the SSB target trigger. C1 is the status quo option, where the trigger trips if SSB is less than the target for 2 years and if F is above the target in either year. C2 would trip if SSB is below the target for 3 consecutive years. And C3 would eliminate the trigger related to SSB target. It's important to note here that there must be at least one SSB trigger. Tier 3 is the recruitment trigger, and this includes options for defining the trigger itself and options for responding to the trigger. And the recruitment trigger is evaluated every year. So option A defines the recruitment trigger. And the question here is, how sensitive should the recruitment trigger be to alert the board to periods of low recruitment? A1 is the status quo option, which is the low sensitivity option that only tripped one time since 2003. So A1 is designed to identify recruitment failure and would trip if any of the 6 juvenile abundance indices show recruitment failure for 3 consecutive years. And the alternative options, A2 and A3, would instead compare the current JAI data for 4 of those JAIs against a period of high recruitment, which would result in a more sensitive trigger. So A2 is the moderate sensitivity option, which would have tripped 3 times since 2003 and is based on the 25th percentile of the high recruitment period. A3 is the high sensitivity option, which would have tripped 6 times since 2003 and is based on the median of the high recruitment period. Option B considers the management response to the recruitment trigger. And the question here is, if the recruitment trigger is tripped, should there be a prescribed response? And if so, how conservative should the board's response be? The status quo option, B1, is the most flexible response and just requires that the board review the cause of recruitment failure and determine the appropriate action, which could be no action. Both alternative options, B2 and B3, may require action to reduce fishing mortality if the recruitment trigger is tripped. B2 would be the most conservative response and may require action to reduce F more often. And B2 compares F to an interim F target calculated using a low recruitment assumption. B3 would be a moderately conservative option that may also require reducing F, but less often than B2. And B3 reevaluates the F triggers defined earlier using a low recruitment assumption. And the final tier for management triggers is Tier 4, deferred management action. And the question here is, should there be flexibility to defer management action in certain situations to address concerns about frequent management changes? So if no flexibility is preferred, then option A is the status quo, which does not allow deferred management action. This means that if a trigger is tripped at any time, the board must take the required action. If flexibility is preferred, the options would provide the board flexibility to defer action until the next stock assessment in certain situations. And the board could choose one or more of these options. So option B would allow deferring action if it's been less than 3 years since the last action was implemented in response to a trigger. Option C could defer action if the F target trigger is tripped and SSB is above the target. Option D could defer action if the F target trigger is tripped and SSB is projected to increase or remain stable over the next 5 years. Option E could defer action until the next assessment if the F target trigger is tripped and there is at least a 75% probability SSB will be above the threshold over the next 5 years. And then finally, option F could defer action if the board has already initiated action in response to a different management trigger. So for example, if the board is in the process of developing an addendum in response to a different trigger. So that concludes management triggers. And the next section is section 4.2.2, which is measures to address recreational release mortality. Release mortality in the recreational fishery constitutes a large component of fishing mortality because the striped bass fishery is predominantly recreational and a majority of the catch is released alive. So since 1990, roughly 90% of all striped bass caught recreationally were released alive, and 9% of all striped bass that are caught and released alive are assumed to die from that interaction. The current recreational management program primarily uses bag limits and size limits, which constrains harvest. And this is not designed to control effort, which makes it difficult to control the overall fishing mortality. So Addendum 6 did start to address recreational release mortality by requiring the use of circle hooks when fishing recreationally with bait. So in order to reduce recreational release mortality, the options in Draft Amendment 7 consider effort controls to reduce the number of trips interacting with striped bass. There are also options for additional gear restrictions to help increase the chance of survival after a striped bass is released. And there are options for outreach and education. So this section is divided into 4 option categories. Option A is the status quo circle hook requirement. And in addition to that requirement, the board could consider one or more of the following types of options. Option B is effort controls in the form of seasonal closures. Option C is gear restrictions, and option D is outreach and education. The status quo is option A, where the circle hook requirement would be the only requirement in place to address recreational release mortality. And this requires the use of circle hooks when fishing recreationally for striped bass with bait, and this requirement does not apply to any artificial lure with bait attached. And currently, there is guidance on incidental catch of striped bass as follows. It is recommended that striped bass caught on any unapproved method of take must be returned to the water immediately without unnecessary injury. Option B is seasonal closures. So option B1 would be state-specific closures during which all recreational targeting of striped bass would be prohibited for a minimum 2-week period. So sub-option B1A would require each state's 2-week closure to occur during a wave with at least 15% of that state's annual striped bass trips. And that directed trip data from MRIP is provided in the draft amendment. Sub-option B1B would require each state's 2-week closure to occur during a wave with at least 25% of the state's annual striped bass directed trips. And if the board selects one of these closure options under B1, the board must also consider Tier 1 to determine whether existing no targeting closures that were implemented in 2020 through Addendum 6CE would meet the new closure requirements. So under option A, the existing no targeting closures would fulfill the B1 closure requirements, but under option B, existing no targeting closures would not fulfill the requirements of B1. Option B2 considers spawning closures to protect spawning and pre-spawn fish. So option B2A would prohibit recreational harvest during Wave 1 and during Wave 2 in spawning areas in the Chesapeake Bay, Delaware River or Bay, Hudson River, and Kennebec River. And states bordering the spawning areas will determine the boundaries of the spawning closures. B2B would prohibit all recreational targeting for a minimum 2-week period during Wave 2 or Wave 3 on the spawning grounds defined by each state. So for these options, existing spawning closures would be applied toward meeting these requirements, and all spawning closure boundaries would be reviewed by the technical committee. So moving on to option C, which are additional gear restrictions in addition to the existing circle hook requirement. Option C1 would prohibit the use of any device other than a non-lethal device to remove a striped bass from the water or to assist in releasing a striped bass. And the draft amendment includes a definition of a non-lethal device. Option C2 would require that striped bass caught on any unapproved method of take would be returned to the water immediately without unnecessary injury. And again, this incidental catch provision is currently guidance for the states, and this option could make it a requirement. And the board could choose either or both of these options, C1 and C2. And then finally, option D is outreach and education to promote best handling and release practices intended to reduce release mortality. So D1 would require outreach and education, which would be included in annual state compliance reports, and D2 would recommend outreach and education. So that concludes recreational release mortality. The next section is section 4.4, the stock rebuilding plan. So the 2018 stock assessment showed that the stock is overfished, and when the board accepted the stock assessment for management use, the management trigger tripped, requiring the board to rebuild the stock within 10 years, so by no later than 2029. And there has been some concern about the recent low recruitment estimates and the potential impact of low recruitment on the ability of the stock to rebuild. So as part of the analysis for Draft Amendment 7, the technical committee identified 2007 to 2020 as a low recruitment period. So the results of the 2022 stock assessment are expected in October of this year, and this assessment will provide an updated evaluation of stock status with a terminal year of 2021 and will provide stock projections. And the assessment will incorporate 2 years of management under Addendum 6, and that would be 2020 and 2021. And for stock rebuilding specifically, the assessment will calculate the fishing mortality rate required to rebuild SSB to the target by 2029. And this F rate is referred to as F rebuild. And if the stock is not projected to rebuild by 2029, the board will need to consider adjusting management measures to achieve the rebuilding target. So this section in the draft amendment includes 2 sets of options related to the 2022 stock assessment specifically. The first considers which recruitment assumption to apply to rebuilding calculations, and the second set of options considers how the board could respond to the 2022 assessment if action is needed to achieve stock rebuilding by 2029. So the first question is, which recruitment assumption should be applied to rebuilding calculations and projections for the 2022 stock assessment? Option A is the status quo, where F rebuild is calculated using the standard recruitment method used in striped bass stock assessments. And this means that the assessment projections would estimate future recruitment based on recruitment values observed from the last 30 years. Option B would calculate F rebuild using the low recruitment assumption. And this would estimate future recruitment based on recruitment values from a below average recruitment period only. So using the low recruitment assumption in option B would be a more conservative approach to account for low recruitment. And this more conservative approach may result in more restrictive management measures required to rebuild the stock by 2029. The next question for the rebuilding plan is, how could the board respond to the 2022 stock assessment if a reduction is needed to achieve stock rebuilding by 2029? So for status quo, option A, if the 2022 assessment indicates Amendment 7 measures are not projected to achieve stock rebuilding by 2029, the board would initiate and develop an addendum to adjust management to achieve stock rebuilding. So under this option, the addendum could be approved by May 2023 with a likely implementation date of 2024. And public comment would proceed through the typical addendum process. Under option B, if the 2022 assessment indicates Amendment 7 measures have a less than 50% probability of rebuilding, and if at least a 5% reduction in removals is needed to achieve F rebuild, the board may adjust measures to achieve F rebuild via board action. And this means the board could vote to pass a motion to specify new management measures. So if such a motion were passed in 2022, these new measures could likely be implemented in 2023 for at least part of the fishing season. So under this option, public comment could be provided during the board meetings, and written comments could be submitted prior to the board meetings. Figure 5 in the draft amendment summarizes these connections between Amendment 7 and the upcoming 2022 stock assessment update. So Amendment 7, with potential final action in May 2022, will determine the recruitment assumption used for the rebuilding calculations. And Draft Amendment 7 maintains status quo recreational size and bag limits and maintains status quo commercial measures. So in October, the 2022 assessment will provide an updated evaluation of stock status, and the assessment will calculate the F rebuild using the recruitment method selected through Amendment 7. And the stock assessment will also develop stock projections based on the status quo measures in Amendment 7. So there are 2 potential outcomes of the 2022 assessment update. The first, on the left side in the green box, would be if the projections indicate that the rebuilding target will be achieved, then Amendment 7 is sufficient for rebuilding and would continue to be implemented in 2023. On the other hand, on the right side in the red box, the assessment could indicate that Amendment 7 measures will not achieve the rebuilding target. So in that case, the assessment would calculate what reduction is needed to achieve stock rebuilding. And to achieve that reduction, the board could either initiate an addendum, which would be option A, or it could take action via board vote, which would be option B, to adjust measures to achieve rebuilding. And then finally, The next opportunity to evaluate rebuilding progress would be the next stock assessment, potentially a benchmark assessment in 2025. And the final section with options for consideration is section 4.6.2, Management Program Equivalency, referred to as Conservation Equivalency. So Conservation Equivalency, or CE, provides states with flexibility to develop alternative regulations that achieve the same level of conservation as the fishery management plan standards. So states must develop a proposal demonstrating equivalency, and all proposals are subject to technical review and board approval. And the Commission's Conservation Equivalency Policy and Technical Guidance document provides guidance on the CE process. So while there is value in allowing states to implement alternative regulations based on the needs of their fisheries, this creates regulatory inconsistency among states and within shared water bodies, and this comes with associated challenges, such as enforcement challenges. It's also difficult to evaluate the effectiveness of CE programs due to the challenge of separating the performance of management measures from outside variables like angler behavior and fish availability. And there have also been some concerns raised that some alternative measures implemented through CE could potentially undermine management objectives. And then finally, there's also limited guidance on how and when CE should be pursued and how equivalency is defined. So the options in this section consider whether to adopt new default restrictions or requirements for the use of CE. Option A is the status quo, and options B through E consider different types of restrictions or requirements. So first, option A is the status quo, where the board has final discretion regarding the use of CE and approval of CE programs. And the board may restrict the use of CE for any FMP requirement. Moving on to option B, the following options would establish default restrictions on the use of CE for certain fisheries, depending on the stock status of striped bass. So when the stock conditions are met, CE programs would not be approved based on the selected options. So the first set of sub-options here is B1, which considers what those restrictions would be. So the board could choose either B1A or B1B, where B1A would not allow CE if the stock is overfished, and B1B would not allow CE if the stock is below the SSB target. The board could also select B1C, which would not allow CE if overfishing is occurring. And the next set of sub-options, B2, considers the applicability of any options selected under B1. So at a minimum, any restrictions selected under B1 would by default apply to non-quota managed recreational fisheries, except for the Hudson River, Delaware River, and Delaware Bay fisheries. So under option B2, the board could choose to extend those CE restrictions to one or more additional fisheries. The board could choose to extend those restrictions to the Hudson River, Delaware Bay, and Delaware River fisheries. The board could extend restrictions to quota-managed recreational fisheries, which would be recreational bonus programs, or the board could extend restrictions to apply to commercial fisheries. So the next set of sub-options, option C, would establish default precision standards for MRIP catch and effort estimates used in CE proposals. So these options are based on the percent standard error, or PSE, associated with MRIP estimates. So C1 would not allow CE proposals to use MRIP estimates with a PSE exceeding 50. For C2, the PSE could not exceed 40. And for C3, the PSE could not exceed 30. The next set of sub-options, option D, would establish a default uncertainty buffer for CE proposals for non-quota managed fisheries. So an uncertainty buffer is intended to increase the probability of success in achieving equivalency for alternative measures. So option D1 would require an uncertainty buffer of 10% for CE programs. D2 would require a buffer of 25%, and D3 would require a buffer of 50%. And option E considers establishing a default definition of what equivalency means for CE proposals for non-quota managed fisheries. And proposed CE programs would be required to demonstrate equivalency to either option E1, which would be equivalency to the percent reduction or liberalization projected for the FMP standard at the coast-wide level. And so, for example, this was the requirement for Addendum 6, that each state was required to achieve an 18% reduction as projected coast-wide. Or under option E2, proposed CE programs would be required to demonstrate equivalency to the percent reduction or liberalization projected at the state-specific level. So the final slides provide information on how to submit public comment on Draft Amendment 7. Draft Amendment 7 for Atlantic striped bass is posted online at www.asmfc.org/about-us/public-input. And the instructions for submitting public comments are also provided on the public input webpage, along with additional summary resources. And the Commission has scheduled public hearings to gather input on Draft Amendment 7. And this slide and the next slide provide the dates and times of the public hearings for each state. And most public hearings will occur virtually via webinar, and a few will occur in person. And here is the second slide of hearing dates and information. So for more information on attending a public hearing and how to register for the webinar hearings, please visit www.asmfc.org/calendar, or you can contact me, Emily Franca, at the email listed on this slide. And you can submit written comments via email, fax, or mail. And all this information is listed on the ASMFC website and is listed in Draft Amendment 7 itself. So you can submit written comments on Draft Amendment 7 via email by sending them to comments@asmfc.org using the subject line Draft Amendment 7. And you can send comments via mail to the address listed on the screen. And the deadline for public comments is 11:59 p.m. on April 15th, 2022.